So in this video, we will see one more example on constructor overloading so that it's clear. In this example, I have changed the employee class a bit. So I have added one new property and couple of constructors. So this is the default one. Then this constructor accepts the integer argument to set the ID. Then we have another constructor that accepts only the name property to set the name. And then we have yet another constructor that accepts both the arguments passed ID and name to set the ID and name both the fields. Now we know a class can have multiple constructors, and this class in fact has 4 constructors. So here the thing is that both the attributes are optional. So the requirement is that if we don't pass the ID, we need to set it to 234, and if we don't pass the name, we set it to NA. So how do we achieve this via constructor overloading without duplicating the code? And here we are creating a new object, employee object, via the default constructor. So we know that we can call one constructor from another constructor using this keyword. This we know. And we also know that this call must be the first line in the constructor. So from the default constructor, we can call this one to set, because we need to set the both properties. Sorry. So we know that we need to call this constructor and we need to pass both the arguments. So we say 234 and NA. Similarly, from this constructor, we know that we have the ID, we just need to pass the name. So we will say we have the ID, so pass the ID, and because we don't have the name, so pass NA. From this one, we know that we have the name but not the ID, so we need to pass the ID, but we can pass the valid name that has been passed to this constructor. Now if you notice, these two calls can be modified further. So we can simply say just call this constructor so that when the control reaches to this constructor, it will have the passed ID as 234 and it will pass on the name NA. Okay. Now if we run so just to revise again, so from this constructor we are calling the one which accepts the integer argument, and we are passing 234 because we don't have the ID. And when it calls this constructor, it passes the ID whatever has been passed to this constructor, and because it doesn't have the name, so it passes the NA value. This constructor has the name, so it is passing the correct name value, but a default ID. And ultimately all other constructors, these three, are calling this one that accepts both the arguments. So if we create a new object of employee class and if we run the program, so we see that we are calling the default constructor, but it is calling this one, and this one is calling this one. So finally we see that setting name and ID both, then because we called because it was called by this constructor, so we see the ID constructor called and then the default constructor called. But if for example we change it to this one, so that we now want to call this constructor directly, we don't want to call the ID one, so we can simply change the code and we can pass both the arguments. And if we run the same program again, we see it's not calling the ID constructor anymore, it is calling the final constructor. So we see setting name and ID both, and then the default constructor called. So that's how we use multiple constructors and overloading. Thank you.